Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another edition to our NACE Calgary webinar series. I'm your host, Brett Johnson, Program Chair for NACE Calgary. So today's webinar features Michael Zhou from Gibson Energy. Michael has over 8 years of oil and gas experience working on pipeline design and asset integrity at both operating companies and consulting firms. He is currently an asset integrity engineer at Gibson's with a focus on enhancing the pipeline and terminal pipeline integrity programs. Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you very much, Brett, for having me. Appreciate it to be on this platform.
Awesome. So what are you going to talk about today there, Michael?
I think that, as the abstract of this topic entails, I'm going to be sharing with the audience here an overview of a case study that we did back in 2019, a series of different mitigation steps that we applied to one problematic pipeline that we saw with, active slope movement. So that's the case study and the bulk of my presentation in one sentence.
That's awesome. Well, looking forward to it. So before we jump into that, I'd like to highlight our annual sponsors. Their continued contributions allow us to be able to provide this webinar series to membership at no charge. And so for today, I'd like to highlight one of our gold sponsors, PipeTech. So PipeTech Corp is a privately owned company established in 1987, providing the tools, technology, and expertise to ensure the profitability and safety of pipelines. PipeTech is a pioneer in the evolution of conventional picking using unique products that offer optimum sealing and scraping properties. The broad spectrum of field experience and knowledge at PipeTech makes them a valued partner with companies around the world who have come to trust PipeTech and ensure the integrity of their pipelines while optimizing flow rates. Ensuring the safety and efficiency of a pipeline is more than just putting a pig in a pipeline, which is why their broad range of high quality products is continuously evolving to keep pace with customer needs and changes in the industry. And of course, all our other annual sponsors, they're a huge reason why we can do what we can do. Our annual sponsors help fund several initiatives that NICE Calgary takes on to promote the knowledge of corrosion, sustainability, and asset integrity to our industry and the next generation of engineers. To each one of our sponsors, we thank you for all your continued support. So this webinar will be recorded and will be posted live on YouTube, as well as all of our past webinars as well. If you would like to find this YouTube channel, please check out our website at nacecalgary.ca and you'll find the link within there. So Michael will be giving his presentation live. Be sure to stick around after the presentation as we'll move into a live Q&A session. Please submit your questions to Michael in your Zoom client, clicking the Q&A buttons on the screen. If you're joining us from YouTube Live, please enter your questions into the comments and I'll be sure to ask them. Try and use the Q&A part over the comment section because it's a lot easier to find the right questions in there. So with that, Michael, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. So a little bit about, the intro about me, and thanks, Brett, for the intro there. My name is Michael Zhou, and I'm currently the asset integrity engineer for Gibson Energy, looking mainly after the Canadian assets, dealing with terminal piping that we have in the two terminals that we have and operate in Hardisty and Edmonton, but also looking at the pipeline network and maintaining the integrity of those assets. So please feel free to leave questions like Brett said through the chat windows, and I'm sure we'll have some time left at the end to be able to answer them. So as you can see, a little bit of the agenda of the presentation before we go into the next slide there is it consists of the following. First, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the Gibson operations and our team's focus is for those who are not as familiar with our company's operating overview. And then getting right into the Moose Jaw pipeline in question here, which is the case study itself. And then slowly kind of zooming into the various background from the river crossing landscape and all the operational details that I'm sure some of you engineers or techs are really willing to understand the situation that we operate our pipelines in. Then we're going to start diving into the inspection data, triggering point. This is the data intensive stuff of the relevant findings, as well as how we were led to the conclusion of identifying the slope movement at this particular environmental crossing. From there, I'll introduce how we utilize risk-based decision-making and risk matrix that we developed and coming up with both the short-term and the long-term mitigation for the identified geotechnical issues spotted, before closing the presentation on a summary on the timeline of how we completed the activities we set out to achieve. So first, I would like to start the presentation by introducing a little bit about the company that I'm with and what we do. So Gibson Energy was founded originally in 1953 and is a leading oil-focused infrastructure and energy storage company headquartered in Calgary, Alberta. With nearly 14 million barrels of storage, we touch 1 in every 4 barrels of crude stream product produced in Western Canada at Hardisty, and has the single largest independent storage facility there. In Hardisty, it's also worth mentioning that we currently have a diluent recovery unit, DRU, being constructed that has hit the news a couple of times over the past couple of months, I believe, with the first phase set out to be in service later in 2021, with an anticipated 50,000 barrel per day capacity set out to the rail transportation facility. Aside from our Hardisty terminal assets, we're also operating in the various other sites, such as Edmonton Terminal, Saskatchewan, United States, and with smaller facility connecting with a network of 600 plus kilometers of pipelines, ranging anywhere from 3-inch to 36 inches in sizes, connecting in between those facilities transporting pipeline grade crude oil and other fluid mediums. A Moose Jaw facility, which is kind of the bulk of this presentation, is located in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. It runs a heavy crude feedstock with the resulting light end product composed of tops, heavy distillate, light distillate, and CVGO, while heavy end products including roofing flux and road asphalt. Since 2017, there was a major shift in business focus of the company, shifting from a crude transportation player that's pretty well known and widespread in the industry to a more emphasis on terminal storage and asset operations. Many people, when they talk about Gibson or Gibsons, may still think that we're a trucking company, but that has not been the case since 2017, and certainly not the case since 2019 when we sold off the last piece of our trucking business. The company has now recognized the need due to the business strategy shift and started implementing the operations management system, or OMS, which helps in addressing high-risk facility and assets, as well as reviewing gaps and carrying out continuous improvement on addressing the various management system elements and processes that entails. From there, a new operations service team was formed and followed by the re-centralization of the asset integrity and maintenance team, which is led by Balak and Apathy. Since May 19, process safety, maintenance management, and asset integrity became the driving force for our team under Gibson Energy. And that is the team I work for, and we really focus on risk identification and risk-based decision-making for any existing infrastructure that's spanned all throughout of the operating areas that Gibson operates. So why is that relevant here? Well, this presentation, therefore, is a showcase of how we follow those process maps, an example of that, at which we first identify this very high-risk problem and was then able to put in steps to mitigate the issues identified on the geotechnical issues that we spotted. So without further ado, let's jump into the actual case study of the day, the Moose Jaw Slope movement. In September 2019, a routine ILI, or inline inspection, equipped with inertia measurement unit, or IMU tool, was run at our 8-inch crude feed line from Stony Beach Pump Station, routing from east to west into our Moose Jaw facility. In accordance to the local watershed report issued historically, the river valley at which the pipeline crossing is located at flows northeast from the city of Moose Jaw and joins the Quattapel River approximately 5 kilometers downstream north of the Buffalo Pound Lake, and is the largest single contributor to the Quattapel River, which is another major permanent river body in southern Saskatchewan. So as a result to that, at the time of the ILI which it was executed, the crossing was already flagged as a very high-risk subject from the risk consequence standpoint, and the consequence study was done in June of 2019 and have been well on our radar. The image that I'm displaying therefore here is the recording for some of the notable features that the tool measured during its run, as well as the snapshot of the elevation profile of the river crossing then. The red line that you're seeing here is the zoom-in pipeline route at the Moose Jaw River itself. As can be seen, there is a dent feature located at the east river bank, as well as the bending stream with ovality feature encountered at the steeper west bank near the water body itself. This finding then triggers a series of investigation, as the strain seen was significant enough, which we're going to get into in subsequent slides of this presentation, to trigger off alarms, as well as the given close proximity to a large water body given this scenario. As can be seen in this zoomed out map better, most of the steep zones were constructed in 2002 utilizing the horizontal directional drilling at depths of anywhere between 3 to 10 meters for the crossing itself, and around just a little over 5 meters right under the riverbank where the HD hits the crossing or enters the crossing. While the flatter east side of the river crossing was constructed in a more conventional trench placement in lower end. Overall, the entire crossing from east to west between the slope crest and the slope crest was measured around a span of 1.8 kilometers. This next slide that I'm presenting provides the mapping of some of the pipeline operating data, as well as the key findings from servicing environment which the pipeline is placed in. In summary, this is the 8-inch Moose Jaw pipeline we operate that transported feed production from the Stony Beach pump station to our Gibson Energy Moose Jaw facility. The license length for this particular segment, which is one of two, is at 13 kilometers with about 4.8 millimeter wall thickness in measurement. And the licensed maximum operating pressure, the MOP, is at 9930 kPa, while the nominal operating pressure over the 17-year span since its 2002 commissioning was anywhere between 6,000 to 8,000 kPa. During its construction, which is a replacement to its predecessor in 2002, we also find out later that there was no geotechnical studies done at the time. We also, and we found out through the Environment Canada data that the river experienced very high intensity flooding during the 2011, 2013, and 2015 summer times. As aforementioned of the high risk impact that this asset entails, we in parallel have already engaged BGC, who is very reputable in the industry for its geotechnical, hydrotechnical hazard subject. First, conducting a review of the existing LiDAR and INSAR imagery on our behalf, and also asked them to conduct a detailed ground reconnaissance with field walk down in October 2019. Once we received the final reporting of the LIs in October, we then immediately overlapped the two studies and looked for common ground bridges. In summary, we found that at the west bank slope side, that there is an ovality feature measured at 11.5% OD, along with a strain feature that is in its vicinity, I believe it's about 3 meters away, in the magnitude of 1.274% in measured. At the same time, the ground team from the BGC unit came back and confirmed that although the morphology of the east wall suggests an old valley scale deep-seated landslide that has been dormant or muted indefinitely, so it's inactive, the west valley wall contains obvious landslide morphology with active toe erosion found at site, suggesting what is called an inferred deep-seated landslide rock. These findings validated that there is activity of active moving landslide at the west slope. With that said, however, one challenge was that BGC at the time could not predict how much further movement can be tolerated by the pipe, or whether or not the pipe is still suitable. As an immediate response to field observation and LI findings, the integrity team began conducting the engineering assessment right away. In parallel to that, the assessed risk was very quickly escalated right up to the C-suite per the Gibson Operation Engineering Risk Matrix, as it was identified this particular finding as what we call the catastrophic, risk scale. They were concerned both the high likelihood of failure and also the catastrophic consequence that it entails. There are a few options that were considered right away. However, each of those solutions proposed at the time faced some limitations and was not possible to eliminate the issue previously identified. From there, it was concluded that installing a replacement horizontal directional drilling to the existing crossing method, coupled with the proven geotechnical study for trench stability, may be the only long-term mitigation method suitable for this problem. The project team was then assembled right away, and after assessing the parameters carefully and ensure that the plan addresses both the east and the west geophysical conditions, the final plan included entire HDD to replace the existing 1.8 kilometer slope with its tentative commissioning into service in Q2 of 2020. This project was preliminary budgeted at higher than $10 million. And by the time that it's said and done, the final cost came back at around $12 million in total cost. spend. The Saskatchewan pipeline regulator, in this case, the MER, Ministry of Energy and Resources, was also notified of the plan and results of the engineering assessment in January 2020. And alongside of long-term mitigations, there is also a very important key elements that must be considered, which is the short-term maintaining operations or impact wear lack of. The splattering question that one must ask in this equation was, well, is the current state of pipeline suitable for operating? And can we operate the pipeline safely? From the baseline of the risk assessment point of view, we then start looking into in details from both the likelihood and the consequence aspects as we conduct the risk assessment. Something to think about based off the information we collected was that along the pipeline experienced, although the pipeline experienced significant bending strain, it has a ovality feature. Was it the primary contributor to the mechanical deformation found at a time during the ILI run? In our study, it was actually found that there were pressure cycling involved. So that must be taken into consideration for assessment as well. The good news, however, is that corrosion is not a key issue found in this pipeline. Overall, I think on the 3-kilometer span that we have outside of the radius of this crossing, 13% external wall thickness feature was found as the maximum or the deepest feature that there was. And there was none over this, West Bank crossing segment itself. So I think it was concluded by us that the potential interactive threats between mechanical versus chemical was taken out of the equation there. From the consequence standpoint, we also evaluate, key parameters such as volume of spill upon a unwanted release, location of those releases as it pertains to potential drinking water contamination. We also looked at contaminated area due to the river flow rate and also its underground water sources. The response time at, if we can respond fast enough, or what is the most efficient way to do that when there is a leak release, leak containment, and also deployment protocols. After those questions, and if those questions can even be addressed properly, the next glaring question would be from the Socratic questioning method is how much longer can we operate the pipeline safely? Dating back to previous NACE Calgary presentation in November by Artie and her folks from DMV, I think one keynote takeaway was that all pipelines are living organisms. Therefore, if we cannot manage the potential changes and have some ways of setting up thresholds for what the red flags are, then it would have been a very risky decision to keep the pipeline in operational status. And it basically set us for eventual failure given the catastrophic consequence upon a release. Some key question therefore yielded was, when did the movement start? Was it abrupt or steady? What are some of the triggering? What is the rate of the movement? And is the movement ongoing or has it been muted for a while? In regards to answering all of those questions from the previous slide, the engineering assessment was performed. Through analysis of the stress conditions, utilizing empirical formulas available in public sources, we calculated that the pipeline out of place displacement was measured at around 17 centimeters. And with a glaring additional 3 centimeter movement, that the pipeline may experience failure due to overstress. Based on the calculation we performed, one of the first tasks we carried out was reducing the operating pressure by over 30% through a proper MOC once this was found, from 9930 kPa, as aforementioned, to 6250 kPa. From there, we then created a sound interior and operations plan, or we developed it, that includes continuous manning of the riser on both sides of the river crossing at all times, whenever the pipeline is in operational mode with fluids in, and other contingency triggers of additional geotechnical surveillance and analysis, as well as site-specific emergency shutdown procedures that will be endorsed and reviewed by upper management on their weekly meetings every week. In addition, we acquire some really good third-party subject matter experience with Skystone and now Acuren, completing a fatigue analysis of the validity through the use of finite element analysis approach, which suggested, as part of their conclusion, that all load cases was considered and satisfied both the API 579 and ASME Section 8 acceptance criteria. And our EA that we wrote out was also reviewed and endorsed by their engineering team. All of the studies that was compiled suggested one thing. Based on the condition parameters we collected at the time, the pipeline was safe to operate. But that isn't enough, is it? Because like I mentioned in the previous slide, things change. And it is paramount for us to quantify those changes if and when we can. Or else our risk box will fall apart again. Again, we may be setting ourselves up for failure in the imminent future. In order for us to address the rate of movement, AKA predicting into the future, we must first look into the past. We first requested BGC on obtaining and analyzing the historical LiDAR and INSAR data, as well as reviewing the 2008 and 2013 LR data that we have available to ourselves, and concluded that there was no dent nor any bending strains observed, and thus suspect that there was no movement at that time, at least when the LI was run. In evaluating the flow rate history of the river crossing, it was addressed that the major flood experience in 2013 may very well have been the trigger for soil movement and the instability of the area correspondingly, while the 2015 flood event definitely worsened that situation of the loosened soil. Look, that is very critical for us. I like to pinpoint that out because if that stays true, the rate of the movement may be much more severe than what we would at first anticipated if we just simply throw the dart and imagine that the bending started in 2002 shortly after its construction. The displacement rate would have been 3 centimeters per year in our conclusion instead of 1 centimeter per year. And we would have mistakenly, without getting into the root cause of things, really miscalculate what the situation or the risk could have been for the situation that we encountered. So for many rounds of discussion with our BGC counterparts, we were able to confirm that the timeline of the initiation of the bending strain experience was happening at 2013, and was then able to set up threshold points, reflex scenarios on when the line will need to be taken out of service and then wait for BGC to perform field visits to confirm suitability from the geotechnical point of view. From what we examined at the time of the engineering assessment, which is January, we obtained and evaluated the flow meter gauge for the Moose Jaw River located upstream of the pipeline crossing. I think it's gauge 05JE006. And that data we collected was right from the source under Environment Canada. The calculated high impact flow event from the 2019 geotechnical report issued by BGC was yielding 35 meter cubes per second as what they consider as the critical flow rate for triggering alarms. While we start applying that safety factor 2, we collectively determined that the 17.5 meter cube per second was going to be our threshold flow rate in shutting the system down, awaiting for further geotechnical review. With that said, and in our review, we noted that historically since 1944, and as you can see in this chart, there has been no such event taking place until at least mid through end of March. While April to June are proven to be more typically where we start seeing high flow event and high flow activities. Some of the contributing factors to that finding may have been due to spring runoff with fast snow melting at the river banks, which is very common, followed by rainy spring and summer seasons. As a result, we concluded that from the perspective of safe interior operations, we have some breathing room in regards to running the pipeline during the winter seasons. And keep in mind, this is in January when we had this discussion, and can hold up with giving us time in collecting more data for the line. So speaking of collecting more data, it is therefore paramount and reasonable too, as part of the recommendation from the EA standpoint, to rerun a second IMU run at the earliest stage which the run would be practical to perform. Simply without another delineation, quantifying the short-term rate of movement due to landslide effect would have been impossible. The next question following that is how we can reduce the risk during the RI preparation and its run, and also whether the plan is robust and addresses all boxes where the risk can be minimized in the pipeline's interior operation. To address that question, many stakeholders were brought in and involved, and collectively the team created that operational risk reduction plan that is tailored directly for this crossing and consider items that may increase the risk of the system as well as ways to address them. The thought process followed too, that based from the results we receive, pending that there is no further movement that we get from the IMU run that we run, the first point possible in the earlier state, we probably should be good to continue to run the pipeline with that operational risk reduction plan in place. As summarized on my previous slide, this is the timeline which details, how the different places or events took place. So first in September 2019, that was when we start running the initial ROI tool, in October receiving the report, along with the final recommendations from the BGC ground inspection. In November, the HDD project team was formed, and the geophysical survey and HDD planning started taking place. By January 2020, the engineering assessment was finalized, along with the operational risk reduction plan as part of that engineering assessment rolled out, and the planning for the second ROI started or began. Moving on to February 2020, the MOC of dropping the operating pressure to 6250 kPa was successfully executed in the field, as well as different control methods were set into place to minimize the operating risk associated with the pipeline whenever the pipeline is in its operating mode. The cleaning run, the gauge pick tool, and the IMU tool run was successfully executed during the second week of February. And it was noted that there is an additional ground displacement experienced by the pipe of measured to be 1.5 centimeter, as well as increasing ovality of the pipeline to 16% from the previously measured 11.5%, I believe. These findings confirm that during the course in between the September 2019 to February of the following year, in that 5 month of span time, that there exists additional active ground movement at the riverbank. Interesting enough, if you recall from the previous slide, that they match quite well with our long-term average yearly displacement in our study, which is computed to be about 3 centimeters per year rate. So 17.5 per the 6-year period. And because of the high consequence entailing to this asset, and also more importantly, because we were able to confirm that the slope movement was indeed not muted at the time, it was still ongoing at steady rate, the pipeline was immediately shut down and purged within the following 48 hours upon receiving the data. In April, the replacement HD was completed, and a new design which considered geotechnical hazard was utilized. The pipeline was routed much deeper than previously constructed segment, and successfully dodged that active landslide zone that was identified. Asset integrity was also involved throughout the design and construction phase of that entire project. The newly placed pipeline was tied in production first week of May and have been in operation since to date. So in summary of this presentation, so we have lots of time for questions from the audience here. Dating back from the initial risk framework establishment and initial consequence assessment taking place in June of 19, to all the way to the commissioning of the HDD, the whole process happened in a really quick turnaround, 11-month span. And the project cost was occurred at $12 million due to the deep drilling and long span that it entails, at a tremendous potential saving of what otherwise, if a failure was to happen, that cost would have been in the magnitude of $100 million based on industry case studies that we found, collecting from statistics. So if there is anything that we would like to share with the audience today, these are the following thoughts for takeaways from our case study. First of all, the corporate risk framework, which is a yielded product from the operation management system, helped in defining the severity of the risk categories for different things that we identify. But more importantly, in our case, it really helped in clarifying the risk escalation guideline. From that, we were able to really quickly fast track the project once the problem was first identified. And once the findings were presented to the executives and risk is conveyed, there was then great support and thoughts, all hands on deck approach in executing both the long-term and the short-term mitigations. A side note that I would like to bring up too here in the summary slide is that as some of you may be aware of, following some of the incidents that occurred near the water bodies in the Saskatchewans over the past decade. There were initiatives that the Saskatchewan Ministry of Energy and Resources undertook as part of an update for PNG 04 titled Saskatchewan Pipelines Code, and categorizing the crossing that I'm showing you today, the Moose Jaw River crossing, as one of the 7 large permanent watercourses in southern Saskatchewan per their new clause 4.1. So what we did, which is showing proactiveness in addressing high-risk assets, certainly falls in good alignment with the direction the regulator is going before this went into effect officially in January of 2020 last year. Next, I think the other takeaway from the encounter was that the fact we were able to assess the geotechnical movement of the soil as a time-dependent threat, just like corrosion. From assessing the environmental data, as well as the triggering event, the historical record information available to us, and alongside with the current state findings collected from the LIs that we get historically, we are able to answer a question that included the slope movement initiation, thus strain initiation, the triggers for those movements, thus also the rate of the slope movement, and more importantly, delineated what the true risks are based on time frame we have, and also from there, develop appropriate monitoring plans and threshold parameters for additional mitigations and actions. Lastly, Socratic questioning mentality, which is the key parameter in our eyes from the risk-based decision-making aspect, really assisted us in asking the right questions to get to the bottom of it, to help reducing the risk of the system in general. Specifically, once the root cause can be identified, the mitigation techniques then becomes practical and quantifiable rather than one size fits all. As well, it enables us some solid grounds when we explain to other internal stakeholders why we had the confidence at the time for safe interior operations, provided, of course, that adequate control were put into place prior to effectively minimize the risk. So with that, this is essentially, in a nutshell, the case study that I'm presenting to you today, and certainly hope that you have had some takeaways for this Lunch and Learn topic. I definitely appreciate your time with me here today and ready to take on the 12 questions that I see on the board here you might have.
Awesome, Michael. That's a very great presentation. Really appreciate you and Gibson Energy sharing all of this with us. I think that's, it's certainly in our industry, it's pretty much no news is bad, no news is good news. So it's really great to sometimes hear a study, for example, that where we've been able to solve a big problem and be able to come out with a good conclusion. So, and that's really great to share. So with that, I'm going to dive into the questions with that. So to start off here, we had one anonymous attendee leave a really good comment about a similar case study that he was potentially involved with related to Husky. There is an IPC paper that he had listed within there. So if you're interested in seeing what that paper is, click on the Q&A button on the screen and you can see his comment on there. So moving forward, yeah, we've got lots of good questions. Continue sending them in. So first question on there. So on one of your slides, you talk about pipeline displacement a fair bit. So how did you guys calculate displacement? How did you know there was 17 centimeters of displacement gone? And how did you know that you only were allowed 3 more centimeters?
So I think it's just looking at the geometry of where the pipeline was displaced, in the trench based on the data that we got. And it was a stress calculation that we performed based on available industry data that we were able to collect. And that's where we started getting the information in and start generating the output based on the different parameters that we consider. I think I saw the question here was a strain-based, calculation performed, or, is it the girth welt strain capacity dictating it? No, but that was actually one of our plans that we were rolling out as part of what we call the Interior Safe Operating Plans, is to get that strain-based calculation done. But I think we also recognize that, by the time that we got it and we got the proposal from our engineering vendor, it was proposed that given the complexity of it, it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks to complete it. And so even at the interior phase, so when we first ran the IMU tool, We said that data is going to go in as sort of the rate of delineation as well as part of their study, which is more current, given that, you know, it was run more recent. But at that time, I think you can see on the timeline there, Brad and others, that, you know, the pipeline was immediately purged because of the severity we found, right? You know, at that point, I think there's just no turning back at that. But that was definitely one factor that we considered and took in as well.
Well, yeah, I imagine at any point on that, that's a pretty big, scary situation, and you want to try and reduce your risk as soon as possible until you have time to understand it. So, no, thanks for that clarification on there. So within your presentation, you talked about using finite element analysis to help determine, I get the safety of the pipeline. Did it help you at all simulate where a failure might occur in that case?
Oh, absolutely. Because you know, again, we were looking into the slide, and the maximum bending strength that was measured was actually not at the place where the ovality was experienced. So we actually modeled the entire segment of the pipeline, which we're starting to see that strength measurement from the IMU2 data. So, and that really helped us identifying where that point would have been. And what's really given us a lot of grief, and I think certain people are asking about strain gauges and inclinometers, you know, those were definitely options and commonly executed, common practice about that. But there were a couple of different difficulties or challenges, I say, given how close that actually is. It's actually located right by the river bank. So it would be a challenge to really get in there and replace that pipe. It would be an impossibility and be a nightmare scenario to go to the Environment Resource System, Saskatchewan, to get the approval and the permit, with the fishery and wildlife that it may impact in the vicinity. So those were things that we took in and really, really thought about and thought through, and we considered all those, options, and said that no, I think the replacement, even though at the higher magnitude of a cost, that was the more practical way to go. And I think Bala had a really good point summarizing it. It was only a matter of time where we have to absolutely replace it, but what we don't want to see is an interior failure while we operate it, because that defeats all purposes. And therefore, I think that was the way that the management reacted and asked those questions. And we went ahead really, really quickly with that quick, simple decision making.
No, that's totally fair. I agree. I think it sounds like that's the most logical course of action. Then it's done with and you don't have to worry about it. I'm shocked to hear that, like, for example, that 2013 flood that you believe was the catalyst that kind of started the whole slide, had quite a big impact on that. Just out of curiosity on there, when you're thinking about what started it and what kind of slides could you be able to handle going forward, do you have any idea what kind of severity that you might be looking at? Were you looking at units like a 1 in 10 year, 1 in 100 year, that kind of thing?
So I think that's a combo question there, Brad. I think you're asking there. So yeah, so let me dissect it a little bit, because I saw some similar questions by the audience there about how we came to the conclusion there. So when we really dug into and deep and asked lots of questions to the BGC, who's the vendor who performed the field studies, I think there were two triggers for Geotech, the slope movement, right? Or the bending strain, or introducing bending strain to the pipeline. One is abrupt. We didn't get into that technical in this, technicality into this presentation, but we can definitely elaborate that too more. There's the abrupt trigger, which means you due to one or two events. And there's also the activeness of the soil itself. And I'm not the SME, that's why I didn't put a lot of it into this. But based off their conclusion, they're saying that naturally what they're observing from their historical imagery review, I think the upper limit or upper bound that they were concluding on based on this particular land area was measured to be about historically 1.5 centimeter per year of movement. So that's what we consider as the long-term movement of the soil being active in its area. But alongside to that, there's those fast triggers. Whenever you start bringing heavy rainfall events or heavy snow melt events, and those are very evidently what we saw in those 2013, 2011, 2015 events. That's where we evidently saw that was the 1 in 100, 1 in 50 year event. And the rain went on for days, weeks, and there were actually flooding reports in the news by CBC on actually Saskatchewan getting a really tremendous amount of water pouring. So those were very evident, because it started deviating from the natural delineation of those growth. So that's when we start talking to BGC and we concluded, no, it cannot be the slow triggering stuff, which is steady stuff. It has to be some, pounding trigger to really cause the event to happen. And when we start looking at the imagery, and those were start giving us more evidence and comfort level that's when it started. It was right after the LI, actually 2013, that we ran, and then we're starting to see some features start to involve, right? And then that's when we start pinpointing and say, okay, this is probably more accurate, and this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Well, how much stress did having the potential 2020 spring and melt come on to push your schedule to getting this finished?
Oh, that's an excellent question, because I think 2020 was a very unique year for all of us. So COVID certainly kicked in, I think, in March, and that definitely had an impact to the construction, right? But I think what we probably would like to call out a success of it is because of, and I won't take credit from it because it's the project team who executed this pretty seamlessly. It was executed really to perfection. All the application went in. Regulator really played an important role in all of that, and being very linear, given understanding the economic consequence that this line actually entails to our operating regime. So we were actually able to get this all done. I think actually 2 weeks to 3 weeks actually ahead of the schedule. And then we were able to get all of the operating, parameters up back in speed, I think the first week of May, and put the pipeline in commission with zero COVID, recording in that. So that was actually, I think, what I would consider as a big kudos to, a lot of our team members who contributed heartily to this project.
No doubt. That's definitely a good success story. So maybe there's lots of questions geared towards around monitoring and how you were monitoring the area for the different changes. So did you, you touched a little bit on different strain gauges on here, but were you actively monitoring these slope movements? Were you looking at monitoring levels within the river, or using any remote cameras or thermal imaging, or anything else on there?
So historically, I think that's another thing that we kind of left out is we actually have inclinometers actually installed in this area. But when BGC went to conduct their site studies, what they found is because those were encountering with, deep-seated, soil movement in other areas, it loses its effectiveness over time, because those soil movement there are some levels of lacking of predictability, right? It works. The analogy I'll use is it works like coupons. You have to get to the right spot to really get an accurate reading on how fast or how slow, your soil is moving in that area. And with this particular case, and I think I can definitely talk a little bit more about some of the other thought, or mitigation that we get in, but all of which share some common limitation is that if it's deep-seated, the finding on the superficial area or the findings may not be that effective, or you start losing accuracy. And we start talking about the accuracy, or the accuracy of a couple centimeters, or even 10 centimeters, and your error that you introduced to the system was maybe at 5 centimeters. I think 8 was what we think is the average like error margin for some of the other patrolling methods that are introduced. You're not starting to see the light, right? Because you can be now on and off, and it becomes rather reactive. So when we start looking into the error margin, ask lots of hard questions to the potential service providers and vendors. That's where we decided to go to. And again, it comes back to, it's a matter of time that we need to replace it. Let's probably do it now to save the hassle, so everybody can go home not having to think about this anymore.
Well, that makes sense. But I mean, certainly part of the big challenges of what you guys are trying to do is, can this pipeline remain in service while we get this repair completed, right? Because even when you guys decided to do it, it still took many months to be able to get to completion, and you still had to make sure that things were going to be okay, and that you could continue operating the way that you guys did.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And you had mentioned before in your presentation, you had only 3 centimeters, of movement that you could be able to do. So, I mean, that kind of leads in a little bit of this one question here, because you mentioned that you used a lot of, you used IMU to try and look to calculate how much deflection went in, and we know IMU can be good, but 3 centimeters good kind of thing. So, I mean, is it possible to use IMU and pipeline structural analysis to develop that relationship between strain on the pipe and measured ground based off of your slope inclinations?
Great question. And I think that actually coincides with our way of thinking as well when we first ran it in September, because it's been a while since we ran it. There was a 6-year gap. And that's why it naturally goes to our decision or recommendation that we got to rerun it, right? To overlap the situation with the same spec by the same vendor, explain the scenario to them, how important it is on this segment, and overlap those two results to give us a really good imagery. It is our belief that if you just run anything inspection tool one time, it's probably not going to give you a really good overview. But if you really want to get into that short-term delineation rate, or even just want to get a true delineation rate, you need to run the tools repeatedly, right? When we do NDEs, kind of same mindset and that we bring in. So I felt like that was the decision that was leading to. But, even before we arrived at that, we wanted to make sure, is it even safe to run an IMU and prepare for that? And maybe it's just time to shut it down. So those was why we asked those questions and conducted those engineering assessments to even evaluate that condition of the pipe was still fit for service, and it was indeed fit. And that was when it led to a decision of running that second IMU, along with all of the other mitigation that we kind of bulked up in the surrounding. But then as soon as we ran it, it was just like, this is way too close, right? So we just absolutely shut it in.
Fair enough. So thinking, it ties in the next question here, thinking about those 2 IMU runs. So did you end up using the same tool? And
absolutely.
What kind of accuracy, fair enough. And what kind of accuracy do you think you got out of that? And were there any tricks that you guys ended up using to make sure that you could get the highest accuracy of IMU rates within the area of the slope?
I think overall, probably this is kudos to the inline inspection technologies. That's really, a lot of R&D dollars have gone in or pouring in. And again, I'm not an expert in the IMU side of things, but we definitely shared this results as soon as we got them with our, ally vendor. And even before the run, we spoke with them very, very, very vocally about how important this is to us, right? So absolutely, we had them reviewing the data, overlapping it, and doing a lot of the pre-prep work for us ahead of the time. And then once we got those results and we start looking at tabulated, the strain measurements, we knew that was the true measurement. And when we overlapped the profile, we were starting to see a lot of good imagery and lights and very, very zoomed in, right, margin. And then we actually see exactly how it evolved in that 5-month span. I was able to make the decision really quick, because if it looks very, how do I say, out of picture, start jumping out of UTEP, that the soil is definitely moving, and there is definitely more bending strain that's attributing to the pipeline, and you can vividly see it from those overlapping in the images.
Awesome. No, thanks for that. So I'm curious, did you get did you get any chance to look at any kind of alternative solutions, rather than just looking to replace the pipeline? What did you guys consider?
So I think there are a couple of things that we actually looked into as part of the commonly industrial practices. So a couple of them including the rerun of the IMU, but as I mentioned, which we executed. But I think the problem, on that is only the current state was going to be presented to you, not the future state. And I think that was the biggest breakthrough in our eyes of how we took on this role, is we were able to actually look into, given the time frame is going to be 5-6 months, is that suitable for that interior service? Because the risk is high, right, regardless. But if we can actually predict that it wasn't going to fail in the 5-6 months, then maybe the risk is much lower because of the time frame that we quantify ourselves into. We also consider LiDAR INSAR, but I think, and it's a very, very common way that I will address, that we use as an industry to monitor soil conditions. But there are 2 issues there. One is that due to the deep-seated scenario that we faced, it doesn't quite adjust what is happening 5 to 8 meters underground, which is the given scenario of, where the HDD drilling happened right aside from the water bank. If it's shallower, then it definitely is a much, much proven, scenario where we can actually watch it, right? To see if there are any new evidence of any soil movement. And also, according to BGC, there was actually no LiDAR and INSAR monitoring, which is a little bit to our surprise, but then we think about there's not much that surprise to us, is that in winter month, because because of the snow piling on the ground. It really hinders the ability and the effectiveness of that method. And this is basically a time frame that we're talking about here. And that's why we didn't consider that. Inclimeters, I think that was the first thing that BGC recommended. And we had extensive chat about them, about, you know, where to place them and things like that sort. But again, it's going to be a nightmare scenario for install because the feature is right by the entry of the water crossing. So imagine the drilling and then also the isolation that we have to put in, and also the application, right? Endless paperwork we have to submit to Environment Saskatchewan to get a permit on the fishery simply on that, you know. So we're like, is that effective? And the same goes with the repair, right? Repair, cut out, and repair. And then the last but not least, flying drones. We also considered that at first, you know, just flying that a daily basis continuously, just to see what that land or soil is moving. Engage a couple of vendors, but I think what came out of that is it's not quite effective in penetrating vegetation. So one thing that they mentioned is you have to cut all the trees, and we have private landowners in that area. So that wasn't really practical. And then plus the snow piling, right, in the winter times. It really hinders the ability of that thermal detection penetrating through to give us, you know, good or accurate readings on that. So further kind of hindering the ability of, you know, introducing more errors. So those were a couple of things that we start looking at about monitoring and looking at. And then we just thought, you know, rerun the IMU. Let's really do an engineer assessment to see if the line is fit for today. And then looking at root causes to see if it's fit for future, say 3-month course of period of time. And then to see whether or not, you know, that land movement, as one of the participant raised up, right? Is that still continuous, or has that been muted for a while? And then we found out it's still active, it's still going strong. Again, at a deep seated level, I think BGC went out and said that, you know, they didn't find a lot of things to suggest those, but if it's 5 or 8 meters deep, it's going to be hard to observe from land surveys, right? So I think, yeah, I think overall, I think we did the right thing, and it was a collective kudos to all of the people in Gibson who contributed to this project, because it was a quick turnaround for those of you who are in the integrity field to get an HDD project done from the time of the finding to the execution in 11-month span time.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, it's amazing how much thought goes into, you know, the final decision. And I know you had mentioned before that a whopping cost of about $12 million
Right, yes.
to execute that. I'm sure, yeah, you want to consider pretty much anything else rather than that. Just out of curiosity, how long was the end HDD from one end to the other?
So I think it was close to about 2 kilometers long in its true length. You know, I think what we like to emphasize is, you know, at the deepest segment, I think the valley itself was about 70, 80 meters deep. So at the deepest segment, it was actually probably around 100 meters deep, because we wanted to get through the 1.8 kilometer range and also mitigate and miss that block of what was identified as giving us headaches, right? I think one audience did ask a question: the same route was used? No, it wasn't. I think we had to actually tie in at a spot which is quite far out, and then start delineating and having the geophysical data to support, right? To support what is feasible and practical. And so I think the current design on the crossing itself, which is moved linearly, I think the depth that it was at about 11 or 12 meters under the water. And it basically, it was a real deep drill. And that's why, and that's the evidence why the price went so high. Because normally when you have a 1 kilometer, you know, HDD, you're talking about $3 to $5 million. In this project in particular, because the complexity of everybody kind of pouring their heart into, it was double that, right? And plus the COVID times execution.
Wow, that's crazy. That's awesome here. Well, we've had a ton of audience interest here. Thanks for everybody going. I know there's still 12 open questions and we don't have time to address anything. So I'm just gonna get a couple more. So thanks so much for huge audience participation. But, you know, you had mentioned before, so when you first saw it, you saw the pipeline deforming a bit and you classified it as an ovality. Did you notice any kind of indication of any kind of wrinkle or any kind of buckle within the pipe around that area?
I think there are some similarities on that. I'm gonna leave that up to our stress experts, which is accurate on this case, to address that in more detail. So if you guys are interested, I'll be happy to share some of that findings from their FEA report. You know, there wasn't any buckling by definition that we saw, but there was definitely vivid signs of ovality. And that was the first question that we asked our ally vendor in this case. for is that, can you guys confirm that's ovality? Because the geometry are different. And then because we ran the IMU too, I think they were very quickly able to get back to us and confirm that was the ovality. And then we start getting to FEA and then to look for buckling, right? And other things, because that's a different monster all by itself.
Okay, and then so this ties into, I guess, probably the last question we'll have for today, but
Absolutely.
thinking about that on there, I know the initial response you had mentioned on there at the start was to have a pressure reduction on the line. And was that, due to this concern of the ovality, or was there an additional concern on there for the need for the pressure reduction, or was it mainly consequence mitigation based?
So I think two contributing factors. So when we looked at the likelihood of the failure there, Brad, was that we looked at the natural movement rate, which is external force that we bring into the picture. But also there's the pressure cycling factor that we also brought in. So the pressure reduction was kind of the natural thought of saying, what can we do to control that aspect of things? Because we are running that pipeline quite often. And we are seeing that there were quite a bit of pressure cycling that were involved with this particular pipeline. So we want to get that at least out of the question first, and then isolate the other scenario all by itself, which is something that, with vivid control that we can maybe get our hands on. Again, right? If that elongates after February, that was our plan. So that was what we thought and did a calculation for, again, stress-based to really address. And that was what we thought is suitable. And it was workable, right? It was a workable limit. So we reduced it right away as sort of the right thing to do from us.
Awesome. No, thanks for that. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining me. This is a great presentation, great answers to the questions, and great audience participation. Really appreciate all the questions that we have. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them on there. So with that, we're going to conclude at this point. Upcoming in our webinar series, we have Daniel Fingus from Corrosion Service, who's going to join us in about 3 weeks' time. So please follow our LinkedIn page and our website for when registration goes live. And so if you yourself are also interested in sharing your research experience or have an interesting case study like this, I'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to me at program@acecalgary.ca, and we'll work to make it happen to bring you here on our webinar series. So thanks again for everybody joining me today. Please be safe. Thanks again to Michael, and take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Brett, in ACE Calgary. Appreciate it.